Hi, welcome to the Twice Exceptional Learners with ASD Part 1, Identifying and Supporting Social and Behavioral Needs. My name is Staci Carr, and my friend here, Josh Taylor, and I are going to take you through this webcast discussing the social and behavioral needs of students with autism. During this webcast, we're going to talk about strengths and challenges of folks with twice exceptionalities. We're going to address executive functioning, functions of behavior, positive behavior supports, social skills instruction and problem solving, self-regulation, and replacement behaviors. To begin, we're going to talk about strengths and challenges. With students with autism, we have a variety of strengths, and we like to talk about strengths far before we talk about any challenges. So with autism, we find students to be very curious, have superior vocabulary, very creative, resourceful, often have a special talent or interest, and that could be in a variety of settings or topics. So it could be with transportation or history, mathematics. They often have a very sophisticated sense of humor, often to far more advanced than their peers, and are often considered pretty clever folks as well. With all those strengths come some challenges that we must address. So for a person who has high intelligence, they can often become easily frustrated and maybe disconnected during class. They can be opinionated and argumentative, and we see this in college students often because they are in a class where a professor may give their preferences or state an opinion, and it's counter to the person with autism's opinion, and so they can become a little bit argumentative and obstinate. So with that, there's also a big gap in an area of organization and study skills. So with study skills, we get a syllabus, we have tests and projects that need to be planned out, but oftentimes folks with autism have a hard time identifying a beginning, a middle, and an end, and how to plan out a task over a period of time. So we're going to talk about how to address those behaviors as well. And as you can see, a couple other challenges might be inconsistent academic performance. So then some of their areas of strength, they might be overperforming far above their peers, and in areas that are maybe more challenging or that's not an interest, they might be underperforming.
Yeah. So one kind of big idea that helps explain and understand a lot of these challenges that Staci's mentioned is the idea of executive functioning. And executive functioning is a set of cognitive processes and skills that are used to control behavior. And so those come in with the planning, the organization, and the execution of these different kinds of tasks. And really, we'll talk a little bit more about how they fit in, but really help to explain a lot of the difficulties with self-regulation and behavior that we see with our students with autism and twice exceptionality, as well as some of the academic skills that we'll talk about in part 2 of this webcast. So, executive functioning is a kind of a complex set of skills and processes, but the way that I like to think about it that makes it clearest for me is like an air traffic controller. So an air traffic controller has a huge role to play in sort of the overall functioning of an airport and air travel. What it is not is flying the plane or anything like that, or building the plane, but it's really crucial in making sure that the right people and the right places get to where they need to go at the right times. So if the air traffic controller is not functioning properly, then those planes are going to end up stalled and delayed because they're unsure of what's going where, and there's no sequence to it. And really that smooth coordination of all those processes is not there in place. So executive functioning is really, really critical to a lot of different parts that we'll kind of unpack as we move through this webcast. So, two big areas that executive functioning impact are metacognition and behavioral and emotional control. Metacognition is really a fancy way of saying thinking about thinking, and that self-reflective process. So metacognition is sort of our ability to kind of reflect back on as we're thinking or as we're doing something, thinking about, where are we at in that process, what needs to happen, and really is critical to a lot of different parts of getting even kind of basic tasks accomplished, from kind of initiating and realizing that something needs to happen, and breaking down, okay, what is step one for needing to do something? How do I get started with something? And so what we see is, a lot of our students that we're talking about today, never get started because they're unsure of how to plan out what step one is. Working memory is also a big piece. If you're only able to kind of deal with one thing at a time and not hold different concepts together at once, that working memory and that processing speed is going to be really significantly impacted as a result. So that's something we need to take into consideration when we're planning for instruction and planning for supporting our students. And then obviously, as we talked about planning and organization, how we kind of set up attacking the tasks that we need to, how do we organize our materials, but also, when we get into more cognitive tasks like writing, how do we organize our thoughts for it? How do we approach those problems? And then also, how do we self-monitor? And that feeds into the next part, which is that behavioral and emotional control. But self-monitoring goes really beyond just self-regulation and also can impact a lot of academic tasks as well. Kind of knowing that you don't understand something and knowing that you may need help with something is also a part of that as well. So all these different parts of really that fundamental issue of not being able to shift between thinking about your own situation can really have a dramatic impact. And then the behavioral and emotional control as well. In a similar sense, as those cognitive processes, emotional processes are the same as well. So if we're not able to sort of interrupt our going through emotions and sort of reflect on, well, I'm getting more and more upset, I need to sort of stop that and change my behavior or change something or get help or do something, then that can obviously be a difficult thing, as well as kind of shifting over between things if I'm stuck on something. So executive functioning really feeds into a lot of these different areas that we'll explore further.
Another area that executive functioning also kind of impedes is that social piece of theory of mind. Mm-hmm. Theory of mind is perspective taking, understanding that my thoughts and beliefs might be very different than your thoughts and beliefs, or that we might not share the same attitudes or opinions. And so as you can imagine, those pieces can really play a big role in some of the social pieces of navigating in a classroom or in projects, group work, or any real social experience, actually. And so these things that Josh and I are talking about, they're used in organization, in conversation, in all our academics, in self-regulation, in prediction. And if we don't have all these things working as that air traffic controller, there's going to be pitfalls. And so we, as educators, need to plan accordingly and support students before we have major behaviors or any sort of anything that's going to affect their learning and the learning of others. So we're going to talk next about behavior. So I like to think about behavior as two separate things, either avoiding something or gaining attention or gaining something. So either you're avoiding, you don't want to do a task, you can't start a task, so you're not sure how to even begin it, so you avoid it altogether, or attention seeking. And this is the sort of look at me, I'm doing something so that I'm gaining the attention of others. And so when we look at difficult behavior, it usually falls in these two categories, for the most part. Sometimes it could be both. So either you are attention seeking so that you're taking away from actually doing a task at hand. So maybe changing the topic of conversation in class or using your special interest to fray from what is being discussed in class. And so it's avoiding what the topic might be that the teacher is talking about by gaining attention with your own interests. And so sometimes these behaviors can come across as aggressive or lazy or flat out manipulation, and that is absolutely not the case. So when we think about behavior, we can't immediately go to manipulation or control. Sometimes this is happening because your central coherence, your ability to get everything together is not working properly. And so we need to think about how we can put those supports in place so that an individual doesn't have to resort to these behaviors or doesn't have that fight or flight and start to engage in these behaviors to the detriment of their learning.
Yeah, and kind of as Staci mentioned, while it's important to make sure that we gather information and can diagnose the function of behavior so that we can work on it, lots of times there are things kind of underlying the surface of that behavior beyond just the function that really get kids into a lot of trouble and get them kind of stuck in a situation where they're becoming more and more frustrated. And so we talk a little bit about kind of won't versus can't. And a lot of times what we see that behavior looks like a refusal to do something or just a stubbornness or an obstinance and just sort of shutting down or, won't, is actually a can't. And is actually, as we talked about, all these different things that are going on underneath the surface that are really preventing a student from being able to do a certain thing. And so it's really important when we look at dealing with challenging behavior with students, especially those with autism and twice exceptionality in other ways, that we look at the kind of the whole context of the behavior. Not only the moment that it's happening, but also kind of the cognitive characteristics of the student that may be impacting how they interact with a certain situation, a certain issue. Lots of times our students with autism can get stuck in a certain situation or a certain kind of rut. It could be a dynamic with a teacher or a dynamic with a peer that they can't find what we call a plan B or another way to approach it. And so lots of times these kind of fall apart because an individual is perseverating on a certain dynamic that they may need help kind of problem solving out of and thinking of alternate ways and alternate strategies to resolve that situation. And I also think it's really important to take note here and reflect on the role that trauma plays with our students. Not just, I think, in the way that we often talk about trauma, but also just in a history of frustration, a history of not being successful at certain things. And I think that goes both into the social and behavioral as well as the academic. If a student has, you're working with a middle or high school student or even elementary school, and they've never been successful in years of math class or doing something, or years of sort of interacting and making friends and playing with students, there's going to be a lot of frustration there that has a traumatic role on how they approach and their willingness to take chances and put themselves out there and try different things. And so there's a lot of different pieces here that I think we need to acknowledge and we need to think about as we think about intervening and providing some supports for the social behavior of our students. But at the core of it, our role as teachers is to help students to find solutions and to find ways to solve their own behavior, because we're not always going to be there, and the parents are always going to be there to provide that support and to help them work through it. So really, I think our role is to provide strategies that students can do independently, that they can self-manage. So that's a lot of what we'll talk about the rest of our time.
And that's really important as a student progresses through school and into post-secondary education or employment. You can't go to a job and have the inability to self-regulate and expect that your employer is going to help you calm down. Those are things that are certainly going to get into their issues with employers.
That's a great point, Staci. I think our role is to frame those expectations as students move through school so that it's not sort of a big surprise when those expectations all of a sudden change, moving from school to work or the community. Absolutely. So, we don't just want to bombard you with, the big issues and the challenges. So, we want to shift to, what can we as teachers do with this information and knowing that there are these kind of cognitive processes that are impacting how students relate and how they're able to address certain issues that come up and problems and situations that pop up in their environment. What can we do about it? And I think here, going back to thinking about how executive functioning plays a role in making it really challenging to predict what's going to happen next, right? If we think about that air traffic controller and we think about really, we can only focus on sort of landing one plane at a time and dealing with one piece of information and one sort of narrow situation at a time, part of what I think we can do is help to provide some structures and some predictability for students, whether that's through sort of some kind of written thing or a schedule or providing alternate strategies to give them kind of a rich context where they can predict and they can see kind of what those different options are, know what's going to happen next. And I think that gives them a foothold to self-manage. And so all the strategies that we're going to talk about really in some way or another are dealing with providing more structure and more predictability to all the different situations that students are facing that they're having trouble with without those additional supports. But all of these strategies are ones that students can pick up, take on their own, and can be taught to kind of self-manage and self-direct on their own.
So one of the things that I'm sure you are all well aware of are the tiered supports, the peer positive behavioral interventions. And the one that I think that we often kind of forget are those universal supports. And universal means for all. So all students benefit from these. And these are tools that every classroom should have, that all students benefit from. And these are the things that if they're in place and they're taught, like Josh said, these are things that students can then take with them as they progress through school, and they can adapt them or modify them based on their current situation or environment. And so our Tier 1 supports are those expectations, those rules, those what you help you get through the day and know what to expect based on whatever class you're in. And so when I think about elementary school, the expectations in music class are going to be far different than the expectations in library. And so setting those expectations ahead of time really allows a student to understand and help them begin to adjust their behavior for the situation. So in music class, you're allowed to talk, you're allowed to sing. But in library, you need to be quiet, you need to look for your book, maybe listen to a story. So those are two different aspects. So if a student goes into library singing and dancing, that's going to be a challenge. So we really want to make sure that we have those expectations set for whatever the environment is. And that same goes for middle school and high school and post-secondary. So we're going to start by talking about rules and expectations. Consistent environment has limits and expectations. And like I was saying, depending on where you are, those expectations are going to change. And they absolutely should change. But we need to make sure that we're teaching our students how they change and why they would change. Because people with autism and twice exceptionalities are rule followers. And if there's a set of rules and you change them without allowing for processing or teaching, then you shouldn't expect that behavior is going to automatically just change and adapt on the fly. So when you have rules and expectations of your class, make sure that the students know what they are. And even if it's halfway through the school year, still have them posted, because you can always refer back to them after long breaks, after spring break or holiday breaks or snow days. Sometimes we forget what those rules of the classroom are. Or maybe we're having spring fever and we forget that we need to sit in our seat and remain quiet and raise our hand. So having those rules posted is that nice visual reminder of this is what the expectations are for our class. And do they change? Again, so based on the environment, are they changing? So sometimes we can even put these in a planner or a clipboard or something or even on a phone that a student can take with them so that they know, oh, I'm going to the lunchroom now. These are the expectations for the lunchroom. Or I'm going to anatomy class, and these are the expectations for anatomy class. So having those readily available and adaptable. So once you have this schedule and these rules and expectations, you can then plan for any changes. So if there's a change in the routine or expectations, or there's a new teacher who's introduced or a new student who's introduced into the classroom, you can put those supports in place to help a student manage those changes. And so, we talk about the importance of, as educators, that you have these rules and expectations, but you also have to follow through on if a student doesn't meet those expectations. And we're not saying that because a person has a label, they should be forgiven for breaking any rules or anything like that. But you cannot consequate a behavior if the student doesn't know what that consequence is. So if a student yells in class and then it gets sent to the office, but there's no expectation that you can't do that, or there's no knowledge of that, then sending them to the office, there's that disconnect of why is this happening to me because I did this behavior that I didn't know I was supposed to do. So making sure that the consequences are available for them to understand and that they know what they are, and then making sure that whatever the consequences are, they match the expectation. So you wouldn't, expel a student for yelling in the classroom, for example. And we see that a lot, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a great point about being very clear and explicit about not only what those rules are, but what the consequences are going to be as well. For me, it's also helpful to think about sort of rules and expectations beyond just those kind of common compliance-based classroom rules. Those are great. Those are super important. Really encourage everybody to have sort of a go-to short list, but also to think about rules kind of more broadly. Brenda Smith-Miles has 2 great webcasts that I encourage you to check out in our archives on the hidden curriculum. And the hidden curriculum can kind of be thought of as sort of other rules that are a little more subtle. They're things that you wouldn't see necessarily posted on a wall, but just those expectations in different environments, and thinking that we have these rules, but one thing we see a lot with students with autism, lots of students, is what happens to the rule breakers who don't follow the rules, those peers that might slip up from time to time. Is whose responsibility is that to address that? A lot of students sort of internalize that and think it's their responsibility, which causes other problems. So I think we need to think about really giving a rich, and don't be afraid to give lots of examples and to show when did the rules not apply? When did they change, as Staci mentioned? It's not just from classroom to classroom, but maybe there are different rules for different people. There are different rules for teachers and students. And those change depending on the context and where we're at. So.
And those social relationship rules are really important too.
Absolutely.
So you don't treat your mother the same as you would treat your teacher or the person at Target. So absolutely, those social rules are great point.
Yeah.
So we talked earlier about the function of behavior. So when we think about behavior, you can't just say that it's a behavior unless you can define it. So, I think about my own children and I'm like, oh, this behavior. But if I can't necessarily define it, and if Josh can't come over and say, oh, that's what that looks like, then it's not really behavior. The other thing is, sometimes behaviors are the same for all students. So if a kid's in a classroom and they're wiggling in their seat, or they're at circle time and they can't seem to sit still, but so that's the behavior of many of the students in the class, you can't really pinpoint that student for that behavior because it's not necessarily different than the other students. And so those kind of fragmented expectations we need to be careful about that. So define the behavior. If someone walks in the room with what the behavior is in a definition, can they actually identify it? And if you can, then that's a behavior that we need to address or that we should take data on and meet as a team to discuss. We need to know, when does this behavior occur? And is it because of some of that executive functioning, that inability to start, not being able to manage all those different emotions and planning and the academic demands all at one time? So figuring out when that occurs so we can put the supports in place where we need to. Like I said, are other kids doing it? If other kids are doing it, then we might need to have more supports at that tier 1 level. Maybe we need to move up to a tier 2 level in some instances so that other kids are also being accountable for these expectations and behaviors. And if it is actually student specific, if it is one person, then we can put even additional supports in. And those are tier 3 individualized supports. And whatever you need to do to make sure that a student is able to manage in their classroom is extremely important. And that really speaks to some of that self-management that we're talking about. Even if in the time being we have to put additional supports in, if they're using those to learn that, oh, in these instances, I have to behave in this situation this way, that's something that'll transfer with them from grade to grade and hopefully post-secondary. We can't talk about behaviors without replacement behaviors. So these are the behaviors that you want to occur. So if I'm upset, I'm not going to reach over and punch Josh. That's not appropriate. So we have to talk about other things that I could do instead. I could take deep breaths. I could just tell you I'm upset. But we need to teach those behaviors so that there's a way to communicate effectively when you have these emotions, because it's absolutely okay to be upset, frustrated, angry. But the inappropriate piece comes in when you are acting in an inappropriate way for the situation. So maybe it's teaching raising a hand. So in class, a kid always speaks out. He knows the answer, and he's just going to tell you no matter what. Even if you say, raise your hand and I'll call on you. So then you teach hand raising. Maybe the student doesn't know how to raise his hand, so you put a picture icon on their desk to remind them that they need to raise their hand. Or maybe there's a cue that they're getting frustrated because they don't understand the content of the instructions. So they have a cue to give the teacher that they need a break or something. So those are some replacement behaviors that we can certainly include, but they're absolutely important to address.
Absolutely. And I think part of when we think about replacement behaviors is social skills instruction. And social skills instruction is a massive topic that we have a lot of resources at our VCU ACE website. I encourage you to check out. There's webcasts, there's seminars, we have fact sheets on social skills. So we're going to get too into that now, but just to illustrate that this is sort of where the social skills instruction can fit in to form some of those replacement behaviors, because when we're talking about challenges with social interaction with behavior, I mean, a lot of this is really key to our students not knowing what those social expectations are, not having the competence or the experience to navigate some of those situations, or when things break down, how to problem solve through it. And so social skills instruction really plays a big role here to frame what those expectations are, to teach those skills. And just a reminder that we always want to be very, very explicit with, especially our students with autism, to be very clear, very direct, because they need that kind of explicit information to understand what's expected. That often our students are not going to kind of intuit or kind of figure that out on their own naturally. But you know, and we want to sort of, as we've talked about, think about those issues with rigidity, those kind of breakdowns with a lack of self-reflection, so providing structuring and scaffolding. And again, really encourage you to check out some of our other resources on social skills instruction. So one kind of strategy that's part of social skills instruction that can be really helpful with some of these situations that we've talked about is a social autopsy. And a social autopsy is one kind of really structured self-regulation strategy that helps to give a format for understanding a messy, more complex situation that involves other people, that involves maybe a novel set of circumstances, something where there was some misunderstanding about what the expectations were or what the other person's perspective were, or often a combination of a lot of these things. And so a social autopsy really gives a format. It's often written in a very structured way that's very predictable. These prompts that you see, kind of what happened, who was hurt, what could be corrected, what could be done next time. These can be modified a little bit, but really it's the who, what, when, where of a problem situation, and gives a place where the teacher and student can sit down together to sort of take a look at it, to break down, to diagnose, to problem solve, but to do this in a way that's written and concrete instead of verbal. So thinking back to that working memory issue with executive functioning, when we're talking through things verbally, our students are missing a lot because they're not able to sort of hold it. You know, when something's said verbally, it's sort of in and out as soon as we say it. And if we don't have working memory to sort of slot it and to make it part of a bigger picture, then a lot of that message is lost. So if we can do something written like the social autopsy that sort of breaks down those complex situations, It provides us a way to take that working memory out of the equation for a little bit and really focus on one piece at a time and build that picture of kind of what went wrong, but how can we do it better next time? And so often this is the foothold that we can use to try to figure out what strategy is needed here and how can we use, what's my student thinking about it? What's their perspective? What rule do they have in their head that may not be the right rule, but it's the rule that led them to get stuck in the situation to begin with? And then how can we work together to figure it out? Because we have to kind of work with where our students at. And so understanding their perspective is really key. And so strategies like social autopsies that sort of give us an insight into their perspective are super critical to helping us to figure out and work through this.
And the likelihood of this happening again, this behavior, this hurtful whatever, is going to be far less if you do something like this. So if you take the time to, like you said, partner together and really try to figure out the perspective of your student and how you can correct things, it's much easier than saying, don't do that, and then it happens the next day and you don't understand why it happened again. And it's because you didn't take the time and didn't really set some visual supports to the situation.
And so sometimes, the written sort of a graphic organizer of a social autopsy on its own can be still a little abstract for some students, especially younger students, but even some older students that still are not quite seeing other people's perspectives or things like that. So one strategy that I love that I think dovetails really well and partners really well with the social autopsy is cartooning. And so cartooning is really taking a situation that involves both the different people as well as things that were done, things that were said, and things that were thought, and really makes those super explicit. And so it's basically making a cartoon strip for a social situation that happened between a couple people. It can be really, really helpful to teach students about others' perspectives and where the breakdown sort of occurred. And so if we think back to the social autopsy, they might not be able to really pull out the salient details of what happened that caused the breakdown. But cartooning is going to really be able to show you, what was done and said, but then also what was thought, like what was missing from because of their inability to kind of see other people's perspectives. What did they miss in that situation that led to sort of a conflict? And what was the other person's perspective that maybe caused them to get frustrated or hurt or shut down or, leave the situation?
Yeah, and sometimes those thoughts are different than the words that come out.
Absolutely.
And so cartooning really helps a person understand how that can happen.
Yeah.
So with twice exceptionality, there's no arguing that academics are very important, and perhaps the most exciting, most I don't even know the right word, but the most successful part of a student's schooling. But we really need to think about what happens beyond academics and have to take the time embedded in academics, embedded in those things that are comfortable and successful for a student, but things like flexibility. So sometimes our schedule changes and we have to be flexible about that. Sometimes we are working together in a group and we have to make compromises. And so really modeling that for students and also reinforcing and praising for those instances. You mentioned earlier that plan B. So I really have this thing that I'm doing, I want to do, but it's not going to happen. And being able to become unstuck and think about what a plan B is. Another thing are big deals and little deals. Sometimes we think of things that are just a giant issue, and actually it's really not. So your pencil breaks. Well, that's not that big of a deal. You can actually get a new pencil, a pen, you can sharpen your pencil, but to some folks, that might be a big deal. So really putting that into perspective, and okay, and you can do this visually also, so you can have levels of problems. And so your car not being able to start, and you're going to be late for work, that's a big problem. You have only 3/4 of a tank of gas, that's not a big problem. You can get more gas. So really kind of putting those things into perspective.
But I think also realizing that, when we think back to kind of the earlier in the presentation and thinking about that past history that a student has. So if you're sitting in a math test and you've had 10 years of flunking math tests, because maybe you need more time and you haven't got that accommodation, or math just isn't your strong suit, and that pencil breaks. And then on the other end, you don't have the problem-solving sort of flexibility to think about what to do when your pen breaks, and now your pencil is broken, and you're going to fail the test. And in your head, you're thinking, well, I've just failed math class, and my mom and dad told me that I don't get to go do this fun thing if I don't get a certain grade in this test. Then that pencil breaking really does feel like a big deal because of these other factors.
It's a very good point.
I think it's important for not only us to teach, but it needs to be a two-way street, a lot of these ideas. Is that I think we as teachers need to understand that in that moment, these feel like big deals to our students.
That's a really good point, and I dismiss that because I'm thinking in my own life, breaking a pencil is not a big deal, but those past experiences are very important. And so as an educator, taking the time to figure out why that pencil breaking was such a big deal for the person, and maybe doing something like a social autopsy or cartooning could help in that situation as well. And then having a choice and not having choice. So oftentimes we don't allow for choices for our students, and so sometimes they can't make a decision, or they don't even know that something could be a choice. So providing opportunities to have choice, like, do you want to use a pen instead of a pencil? That's perfectly okay. Or you have to do this worksheet or this reading assignment. I don't care when it gets done in this period of time, but you can, as an individual, make that choice, which will, down the road, is going to really benefit them because they can then begin to self-manage and understand that, oh, I have to get these two things done, but I could do maybe my preferred thing first. Or I can do this and then that and then switch back. Of course, with support and visual accommodations, which we all need. And then handling the unexpected. So these are things like the, oops, there's a change in our schedule, or, oh, something went wrong, or my pencil did break, and how am I going to navigate through that situation? So understanding those replacement behaviors too.
And I think one of the really powerful things about some of the terminology here is really sort of labeling it and using it frequently so that students can start to pick up on that language and really start to identify that for themselves. For instance, teaching unexpected things, or for younger kids, sometimes we call it kind of something wacky, and really starting to build that into a student's vocabulary and way of thinking about when things come up. When unexpected things happen, it's not always a big tragedy. Sometimes it's a good thing. Sometimes it's just something we need to build into our understanding in the moment. But really labeling these and teaching these and making them part of the way that students kind of talk about and also kind of process their day-to-day is really, really critical.
I saw a teacher who had a schedule in their classroom, and they had question marks throughout the day. And those were things that she had planned to be surprises, so that the students wouldn't necessarily know, but they are starting to understand that, oh, something is going to be different or something is coming up, but we can't quite plan for what exactly it is, but we can alert ourselves and develop those coping strategies and those self-regulation skills for when those things occur.
I love it. Great.
Speaking of self-regulation skills, so these are things that we need to be able to do throughout our life. And so we have three things that we can think about. Sensory supports, because oftentimes those things are really some of the most calming things. So whether it's noise canceling earbuds, or lights that are different, or a good smell, something that is calming to a person. Or something like calming techniques, like taking deep breaths, or counting backwards from 10. Those are things that will help a person begin to regulate themselves. And you need to provide visual and perhaps verbal cues. So in one of my past jobs, we learned about relaxation. And I thought, wow, relaxation, of course. But it was interesting because it was very systematic in a way to teach what exactly that stressed feeling is, and then how to relax your body, so that when you say relax, a person actually knows what that means. Or when you say take a deep breath, it's not hyperventilation, it's an actual process. And so providing those supports so that they can take those self-regulation skills. And also sort of those thinking, putting yourself into those places that make you happy, or, I can stay calm in this situation. I know this is going to be a challenging math test, but I've studied really hard and I know I can make it. I can do well on this. And so learning to do some of that self-talk are good strategies.
Yeah, and I also just want to emphasize the self part of self-regulation.
Right.
I think these are skills that we're teaching students to do for themselves, and there needs to be some ownership and some choice making about what works for students. What works for one kiddo doesn't necessarily just translate over
Absolutely.
to another, and what works one day may not translate for the other. So if we're talking about sort of those calming strategies or sensory strategies, really these are ones that we're not saying like, oh, I'm going to comb you with this brush and then squeeze you 10
Right.
times. This
Right.
is something that a student kind of identifies as something that is calming to them in that moment, and sort of we can help them match with the situation.
And kind of build their toolbox of strategies. Absolutely. So here are a couple other strategies that are out there, visual supports. One of the great tools is a 5-point scale. And I always say that I can 5-point scale pretty much anything. And this one that you see here is about kind of that emotion regulation. So if you get to a 5, that means I'm ready to explode. I need adult intervention or else I'm going to really have a challenging behavior. But it gives you strategies along the way. So this is how you feel, this is what it might look like, and then you can also add strategies. So at a 2, I'm doing okay, things are going well. I might be a little bit unhappy, but I can think about something happy and I get over it. Or I'm getting frustrated and I need to ask for a break. So when I'm frustrated, I start to get kind of tense, and I'm starting to have this kind of boredom feeling or angry feeling. So I need to say, I need a break now. And so it gives you an idea of how to manage your emotions, how to identify them, and how to match appropriate coping skills. That's self-regulation that's appropriate for the student in a situation. And here's a coping skills, some things that a person can do easily, and it's a nice visual. This is something that can be put on a desk or in a note card, or even folded up on a piece of paper in their pocket. And so just knowing that that's there can trigger that, oh, these are some calming strategies that I can do.
Yeah. One of the things I love about these strategies, Staci, like 5-point scales or zones of regulation that really kind of break down those levels, is that it really allows you to have students start to see that I feel differently in different situations, and then also like how does my individual body feel? What are my thoughts and feelings when I'm at a 3 are probably different than anybody else, and then what are the strategies that I can match when I feel my blood or my heart rate increasing, or when I feel like I'm short of breath. What can I do about that?
Right.
And start to sort of build that understanding in that in the moment is sort of too overwhelming to process.
I also like that it doesn't shame these emotions and these feelings.
Yep.
It's important to identify them. We all have these feelings, and it's not bad. We just need to know how to deal with it appropriately.
Yeah. So I want to share a story about a former student of mine that sort of pulls in a lot of these different things that we've talked about in kind of a real-world example. So this was a student that was a high school student in a math class and had some history of just frustration with teachers. Teachers hadn't really got him. He was a super bright kid, had just an amazing mind for all different subjects, loved history, and was also quite good at math too. But because of that history of frustration, really had a little bit of a kind of short toleration for this kind of interactions with teachers, and came to me at one point and shared that he thought his math teacher hated him. And I knew the math teacher. It didn't seem like the kind of guy that would hate a student. Certainly seemed to like the student quite a bit. And so, we did a little bit of sort of investigation and used some social autopsy to try to figure out what was going on. And what emerged was that the student felt like the teacher showed that he hated him because he made him redo the problems, the mistakes that he had made on his math homework and math quizzes. and the student felt like the teacher was, the rule that he had in his head was that, well, the teacher must hate me if he's taking my mistakes and shoving them in my face. And so the student really felt like this was a sort of shaming activity, it was a shaming exercise in front of the whole class that this guy was having to redo it, without seeing that all the other students were having to redo their mistakes too, and really seeing that bigger picture of how error correction is really, and being able to learn the patterns of mistakes that you make in math class is really crucial and integral to the learning process in math. And so, with that understanding, we sort of talked through a little bit of kind of what error correction was, and sat down with the teacher to sort of come up with a plan. And so this is an example of a strategy that we came up with that was really unique to a certain situation. So in addition to some instruction and some explanation of sort of error correction and correcting mistakes, and how students and teachers were part of a learning partnership, we also made this graphic organizer that, again, gave some structure and gave some predictability to that error correction process. And so it wasn't this scary dynamic between the teacher and the student, but really we could look at it, it had rules to it, it had a predictability to it, and was able to take a lot of that anxiety and take the sting out of those frustrating situations. And so, the student could see right there if a problem was incorrect, what could they do about it? Well, how could they review it? How could they see what that process was of learning these things and really see their own progress over time? So this was a strategy that was very successful, I think, because it used sort of took the time to understand what was going on, what was the perspective of the student, and then worked with the student to find a common or a strategy that provided some structure and led to a good outcome.
I like this a lot, and I could see how it could be useful for sometimes teachers really want students to show their work all the time, but students who are gifted really don't have to show their work because they know it. They do a lot of the processes in their head and can just provide an answer, or like one step instead of 18 steps.
Right.
So this is a nice tool for that too. So did the student get it correct? Yes? Okay, we're good. If they didn't get it correct and they didn't show their work, well, now we have to go back and let's show our work so that I know that you do know the process. And so I think that would be good for that situation too. I like that.
Absolutely. And I think that brings up another good point of sometimes as teachers, that advocate for our students, sometimes it's conveying a message to our teacher peers as well to have a little bit more flexibility with some of their approaches and, focus on the key goals and objectives for the student rather than getting hung up on some more arbitrary expectations. So as kind of we looked at already, a few of these self-monitoring systems can take on a lot of different forms. The 5-point scales and the menus of calming choices are some tools that we use to promote self-regulation and self-monitoring for our students. But there are some other strategies that we can use to give students a little bit more ownership and a little bit more understanding of kind of what the expectations are and what those consequences that Staci touched on earlier. And so behavior contracts are one of these that really outline kind of what are the expected behaviors that we want to see and what are the ones that we need to avoid, and then sort of what's going to happen as a result. And so it's a way to kind of get buy-in, but also to make a student part of the framing and following through on those expectations in the classroom. So it can be a really, really good one with our twice exceptional students who really get it, but may need a little bit more structure to really see kind of what's expected and what's not. Another of these, really looking at the picture in the middle is the escalation of behavior graphic, and so really shows similar to a 5-point scale, but a little bit more visually. What does it look like as I'm feeling more and more out of control or more frustrated or upset? How does my body feel? And then you can see my tools there. So those strategies have their own place. That as I'm sort of ramping up this volcano, how can I sort of help to bring myself down and stop that process before it leads to some of those negative consequences? And then again, we talked a little bit already, but when we teach replacement behaviors, we want to kind of follow what we know is best practice for teaching some of these more social skills to students. We want to use a lot of modeling. We want to be very explicit with the instructions and provide a lot of opportunity to practice these skills, to rehearse them in natural settings. So it's not really enough if we're just doing it one-on-one or in small groups in a separate environment. If we're working on something, a behavior that needs to happen in a gen ed classroom or in the lunchroom, we need to be in those environments practicing those skills. Absolutely. And if it's a behavior that cuts across a lot of environments, we need to practice it in a lot of environments too, in those natural settings to make sure that students can generalize those to different contexts. And then we need to provide reinforcement. There needs to be a motivation or a reason that students are doing them. It's not enough to just expect the intrinsic motivation to kick in with students that are taking a chance and trying to do something that's a little out of their comfort zone. And they might see the benefit, even though as a teacher that this is going to benefit them in the long term. If they can't get that reinforcement in the short term, they might not be willing to risk or try to adapt to that new skill. And so in wrapping up, we've covered a lot of different areas, but I think that the key points that, for me, that jump out are really remembering that folks with ASD and other twice exceptionalities perceive things differently. The way that they experience and process information is fundamentally different from a person without autism or who's sort of neurotypical. And I think it puts the onus on us as teachers and those that support these folks that to think about a can't versus a won't, and that sometimes that what can seem like a refusal to do a certain thing or something that's willful is actually underneath the surface something that there's a breakdown that's happening with understanding. When we're looking at behaviors and challenges that happen in the social environment at school and in the community, we want to focus on replacement behavior and on providing reinforcement. We don't want to punish students for doing something and try to get them to not do it. What we want is to think of what is the appropriate replacement or analog behavior that students should do instead. And then we want to encourage them and reinforce them for doing that. We want to teach social skills like flexibility, like some of those great terms that Staci mentioned, the Plan A and Plan B, the big deal, little deal. Teach students the self-regulation process. Start to teach them some ways to problem solve on their own through a social autopsy or through finding a strategy that works for them in a different situation and really encouraging them to use it on their own, try to fade out our adult support over time so that they can take ownership over that. And so this is wrapping up part one, but we also hope that you'll check out part two, which focuses on some of the academic strategies that we can use, because as we've touched on a little bit earlier, executive functioning and some of these issues don't just impact the social behavior, but also have real ramifications for academics. And even though our twice exceptional students often are quite gifted academically, there are some breakdowns that occur that are kind of specific to certain situations that while a student may still do very well overall in a certain subject, they may have breakdowns that are preventing them from reaching their full potential. And so we'll talk a little bit more in part two about how we can diagnose some of those issues and how we can start to provide some supports and remedies for those. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you found this talk useful. I'm Josh Taylor. And
Staci Carr.
And thanks so much.